While everybody else was sleeping, Jerry Dipoto and Scott Service were playing 4D chess. And that's because the Seattle Mariners have re-slotted their starting rotation for the stretch run to get into the playoffs. And it gets really interesting for the last couple of games in the season. But first, let's see what Daniel Kramer had to say about how the Mariners re-slotted their rotation. Now, of course, this goes into George Kirby getting scratched from his start the other day. He was ill of some kind, dealing with some sort of stomach illness. But with that being said, was this actually part of the plan? Kramer says the Mariners will roll with Logan Gilbert on Friday, Luis Castillo on Saturday, and George Kirby on Sunday when they face the Mets in New York this weekend. So when you look at it, you have your three best pitchers going back to back to back. Obviously, before it would go like Luis Castillo, then Bryan Woo, then George Kirby, then Bryce Miller, then Logan Gilbert, so on and so forth. Somehow that starting five, it just got all mixed up with guys coming in and out of the rotation, of course injuries as well. But now, barring injury, the Mariners rotation will go something like Logan Gilbert, and then Luis Castillo, and then of course George Kirby, Bryce Miller, and then Bryan Woo. Bryan Woo being your 5. Technically, you have Logan Gilbert slotted as your 1, but you have your 3 best pitchers going and they can all pitch in a single series. Now, with that being said, how does that line up with the rest of the schedule this month? By the time you're watching this, you probably already know what happened between Logan Gilbert and Kodai Senga in the first game versus the New York Mets. I'm recording this on Thursday. I don't know when it's coming out, but nonetheless, Logan Gilbert, Kodai Senga, and then you have Luis Castillo at the time of recording again. It is TBD, and then the next day you have George Kirby versus Tyler McGill, I think. So that gets you through your first 3 games versus the Mets. Then in your next 3 games versus Cincinnati Reds, you would have probably Bryce Miller, then Bryan Woo, then Logan Gilbert again. Against the Tampa Bay Rays, a team that you could be chasing in the wild card, you'd then go Castillo, and then Kirby, and then Miller, Woo. That would bring you to the Angels, where you would go Logan Gilbert, and then Luis Castillo, and then George Kirby. Off day on Thursday, and then you take on probably your hardest opponent of the month, the Los Angeles Dodgers. This is where this doesn't work out all that well because the Mariners are going to have the back end of their rotation going here. That would line up some sort of way as Bryce Miller, Bryan Woo, Logan Gilbert. But in these 3 games versus Oakland, you would have then Luis Castillo, George Kirby, and then Bryce Miller. Away in Texas, it would go Bryan Woo the first game, and then Logan Gilbert, and then Luis Castillo on the 24th. Against Houston, you would have George Kirby, and then Bryce Miller, and then Bryan Woo. And then it comes to that final series of the season against the Texas Rangers. 4 games versus the Rangers, where it would go Logan Gilbert, Luis Castillo, George Kirby, and then Bryce Miller finishing it out on October 1st. So whether or not it was intentional for the Mariners to re-slot like this, we'll probably never know. But it's certainly there. For the last series of the season, you have 3 of your best starting pitchers going, starting with Logan Gilbert, throwing Luis Castillo the next day, and then George Kirby. Of course, then your rotation can re-slot depending on if you're in a wild card or in the division. If you're in the wild card, you probably have Luis Castillo and George Kirby relatively rested at that point, or even Logan Gilbert rested by the time those games come around because they pitched the beginning of that Texas series. Bryan Woo would probably be out of the bullpen at that point, I would assume, if you were to be in a wild card series, but if you're pitching for the division at that point, everyone will be rested. So while you can look at it right now and say, okay, the Mariners are throwing their 3 best pitchers versus the New York Mets, and I don't disagree that the Mets are going to be a very hard challenge for the Mariners. I honestly would rather have our best 3 pitchers against Cincinnati in the Great American Small Park, but, you know, here we are. But the Mets do still have some great hitters, including, of course, Francisco Lindor. Pete Alonso still in that lineup, and you're going to be getting some of the best pitchers that these guys have, including, again, the Mets with Kodai Senga. I'd assume during the series with the Reds, you will end up seeing Abbott and Hunter Green. But it's this time of the year where things start becoming a little less about, hey, just throw your guys out there, and more about planning. Sure, with a couple off days baked into the schedule, you could even end up skipping Bryan Woo a few times to keep his innings down, but realistically, you're just trying to get your best guys out there a few extra times. So in this series versus the Mets, you hope to take 2 out of 3 with your 3 best guys on the mound, naturally. Hopefully, Castillo and Kirby can put together some really good starts, and Logan Gilbert is always the wild card. Sometimes he looks like he's the best pitcher on the planet, other times he looks like a number 3. But this is what playoff teams do. They slot their rotation to give them the best possible chance against the hardest possible opponents. And for the Mariners, those last 10 games of the season are truly, truly going to change whatever happens in the postseason in 2023. It will all come down to those 10 games. I can all but guarantee it. The real big worry is what's going on with Julio Rodriguez. And Joe and I talked about that in the Hit It Here podcast this week. Go ahead and check that one out. Appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.